On behalf of the community of St Edmundsbury Cathedral, the very warmest of welcomes tonight to the inaugural Ronald Blythe Memorial Lecture. At Ronnie's memorial service, we made a promise to do two things, one of which was to create a lasting memorial to Ronnie here in the cathedral, more about that in a moment, and the other was to have an annual memorial lecture that would address themes around the arts, poetry, literature, and spirituality. It's taken us a while to get round to it because we knew we could only really have one speaker, and he's a very busy man. But he kindly agreed to come, and so we're thrilled. We're thrilled that you're all here as well, members of the community of the cathedral, or resident in Suffolk, or friends. Many of you who are here are Ronnie's dear ones who have gathered tonight, and you are particularly warmly welcome. You know who you are. And it's a delight for us to do the thing that cathedrals are called to do. I mean, all churches are called to do it, but cathedrals as well, which is to be a place of reflection and thought and formation and debate. And so the annual lecture, which will focus on the arts, which we're hoping can happen around this time of the year every year, will, I hope, go into your diaries. I'm sure you've switched off your mobile phones or put them to silent. Might just be worth checking. I hope it's all right that this is being live streamed. And I hope that's all right with you, because there are some who would love to have been here in person, but they'll be watching on the live stream. Those of you watching on the live stream, you are really welcome. After the lecture is over, and Archbishop Rowan will speak for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be about 20 minutes for questions, and my glamorous assistant and I will rush around the cathedral with hand mics, hope to get to all of you. But you will be aware of books being sold at the back of the cathedral, particularly Ian Collins' Blythe Spirit. If you're lucky, you may get it signed as well. But there are also a number of books by Rowan, which will be on sale afterwards, so do feel free. Contactless payments are available. One of the things that Ronnie described himself as is basically a listener and a watcher, absorbing without asking questions, but not forgetting things. The role of the writer, the role particularly of the poet. Those of us brought up on Akenfield, perhaps initially reluctantly at school, and then with delight and passion later in life, and are so aware of not only Ronnie's chronicling of a bygone age, but also his acute, compassionate but unsentimental observation of some of the great movers and shakers in this county, East Anglia, and our century, whether it's Britton and Piers, for whom he worked in Aldborough and Imogen Host, or Let Haynes and Cedric Morris at Benton End, or the Nashes at Bottingham's. Those of us who've fallen in love, in my case slightly late, with Ronnie's writings, having been enchanted every week in the Church Times by word from Wormingford, have a real sense of delight in his writing and the acuteness of his observation. So he would have been thrilled to see all of you here tonight. We are in the midst of a great big scheme at the cathedral, which I won't dwell on tonight, but suffice to say that the great south doors there are going to be glazed. And because of Ronald's ability to shed light and be transparent in the way in which perceptions could come through his writing, we are going to make the glass doors a memorial to him. We're going to engrave them with flowers and plants from Suffolk and East Anglian countryside, which I hope would have pleased him, and also have some of his writings engraved on those doors. And that, I think, has felt to his executors a good thing to do. So when the scheme gets going, we'll be doing that work, and maybe we'll stay in touch with you about that, because you might like to be associated with it. But the Friends of the Cathedral are seeing that as something of a priority for them, and money was collected at Ronnie's memorial service, which has been kept safe for that piece of work. So that's just something to entice you, which will be something of a lasting memorial to Ronnie going forward. But this lecture is also a lasting memorial and a celebration. So more than enough from me, and may I invite you to welcome Rowan Williams.
Good evening, everyone. It's an enormous pleasure and a real privilege to be here to deliver the first of what I hope will be many and many more distinguished Ronald Blythe Memorial Lectures. There's clearly something in the water and the air in Suffolk that is quite nurturing of geniuses of various kinds, when you think of the last few centuries, from Clare and Constable to Britton and Piers, and not least Blythe. But I'm going to begin with a little theological image, and I promise you that there won't be too much theology from this point on, except implicitly. You can tell me afterwards if you picked it up. But the theological image is this. When we as Christians open our Bibles, we look into a landscape that has already been looked at. We read a book that has already been read. And instead of this being some kind of burden or distraction in our reading, it is an enrichment to look at a text that has been read, that has been loved, digested, and thought about. Just as when, for example, we go into a gallery and look at a great painting, we know that this is, in its way, a text that has been read and loved and looked at. And art always takes us on that extraordinary journey from looking at to looking with to looking through. We look at a work of art, we look with the artist, we look through the work as it is finished. And in that process, we see more fully and we see more deeply. All of which is a way into thinking about what, very fundamentally, Ronnie was about. Sharing a gaze, sharing a contemplative perspective, letting us wander in a landscape that had been looked at. And of course, in his own writing, he was consistently aware of the way in which what he looked at, what he was digesting and reflecting on, was a text that had already been read, a landscape that had been seen and inhabited, a history that had been told and heard. And part of those inimitable reflections, I say inimitable, though occasionally parodiable, those inimitable reflections have to do with that sense of sharing in a continuing act of looking and absorbing. T.S. Eliot famously says in the Four Quartets that the roses had the look of flowers that were looked at. And whatever exactly he meant by that, what we emerge with from reading Ronnie and so many other great artists of place is an enhanced sense of a place as something that has been looked at, that has held and enlarged a human vision. So that's where I begin. in that experience of being inducted into a landscape that has been looked at, sharing what has been seen, looking not only with but through the eyes of others. Our own perception, our own history being just a part of what there is to be absorbed and seen and understood. It is in a way the very opposite of the cultural passion at the moment for immortalizing every moment in photographs. I won't even start on selfies. But the photograph which seizes an isolated moment that I perceive and shares it round simply as this is what I saw is something rather different from the inhabiting of a view, a perspective, a landscape which says this has been seen and is being seen and will be seen by more than me. And where I stand and what I see is only part of the reality as it emerges in the relation between what's there and the people who are looking. That sense, when we enter into such a work, that sense of being part of a communion that endures, that's perhaps the most significant thing that work like that of Ronald Blythe opens up to us. To put it in very simple terms, there is always more to be seen and heard than we can see and hear. We might almost say the beginning of wisdom for human beings lies there. There is more to be seen and heard than we can see and hear. And so, as we see and hear from our unique position, we are invited and encouraged all the time to have our eyes and ears open for that not quite in focus dimension of what we see that has been seen by someone else from somewhere else. And with that awareness of what is around, in the penumbra of our seeing and our relating, in that awareness, our minds begin to lose their tight, paralyzed grip on the self's unique perspective and begin to open out into what I call just then communion. So to recognize that a landscape, a place, is always already seen, experienced, narrated, and inhabited, that's a kind of dispossession, a kind of stimulus to letting go of the tightly defined perspective of the individual self. This landscape that I see is mine and it's not mine. Its fullness is something that can only be brought to light and brought to words in sharing, in listening, in conversation. And Ronnie's evocation of landscape and locality is always an invitation to that kind of listening, that kind of conversation. There is more to be seen and known than you can know and see. Enter into that continuing engagement, reflection, participation. The landscapes that we encounter in Ronnie's work are made precisely from that history of being seen, being inhabited, being represented. And that willingness to create and recreate a locality, a view, a place, a story in communion, that I think is perhaps the spiritual center of how we really and truly as human beings inhabit the place we're in, the planet we're on. And when all that has been said, people will inevitably point out, and rightly point out, that the experience that suggests, the experience that takes for granted, of having time in the same place, reflective time in the same place, is increasingly rare. It's rare for people in a mobile society, let alone a society which tends to keep us all at arm's length from this participatory relationship with what's around us. It's tragically rare in our world, where the numbers of displaced persons is higher than ever in human history. And to recognize that, and to weigh that as we celebrate the legacy of seeing and inhabiting, is not to undermine the truth that that inhabiting contains. It's rather to say we have an enormous amount of work to do, not to restore a fantasized lost past, but understand more fully what it is now, to make it possible for people to inhabit their world, to be where they are. And that can be through art and music, and it can be through human hospitality, and it can be through conversation. It can be through the long and difficult work of listening to someone's experience of being literally dispossessed. We argue endlessly in our society at the moment about the experience and the challenge posed by migrancy. I'm struck most often by how very seldom the voices of actual migrants are heard in that discussion. But that's perhaps matter for another occasion. But it's interesting to note that in recent years, more than one writer from a far more secular background than Ronnie has raised the question of how it is that we might recover a sense of groundedness. Stephen Lovett's book, Enchanted Ground, subtitled Growing Roots in a Broken World, is one such essay in reflecting on what it is we are losing, what it is we have somehow to recover, the nature of groundedness, and the way in which inhabiting a place is becoming part of a conversation with it. I pick out just a few elements of Lovett's book. He's writing partly about his own childhood experience on the Welsh border, but more generally about what it is to discover the importance of groundedness. And he quotes from Ian Hamilton Finlay, Scottish poet and thinker, and Keane Gardner. It is the case with gardens as with societies. Some things require to be fixed so that others may be placed. Some things require to be fixed so that others may be placed. To create a landscape, an intelligible habitat, some things are just there, and in just being there, suggest the organization of other things around them, the placing of things, words, memories, and experiences. If nothing is fixed, nothing is placed. If nothing is placed, you might at any point be anywhere, at any time. Many years ago, I had a conversation with a rather terrifying Canadian sculptor who liked to say that he thought that his work was the logical next step for sculpture after Rodin. Quite a claim. But among the many things he said was that he thought airport lounges were a preparation for the dystopian future in which we were to be encouraged to be nowhere in particular for as much time as possible. Airport lounges, he said, are getting you ready for space travel, and that's not good news. It's getting you ready for being nowhere in particular. Nothing fixed, nothing placed. No inhabiting, no shape. No language, no conversation. No story to be told, no story to be heard. Later on, Lovett reports a number of conversations with people trying to find their way back into some kind of more fruitful relationship with landscape and environment. One of his companions says this: "The companionship of working on the land together with other people is good for society, good for localism, good for your own mental health. Natural resilience and community resilience go together. And it's resilience we need to be building, right? Not happiness or feeling good about ourselves or anything like that. It's about what you do. And through acting, you start to see differently too. Acting in a certain way in your environment, caring in a certain way for your environment, allows you to see it differently. Not about happiness, but it is about durability, about resilience, about what lasts. And for us, says Lovett in another conversation, the world only exists in act, doesn't it? It's in the unity of the knower and the known, the seer and the seen, that the cosmos exists. I mean, not the physical universe necessarily, but the world as a place where humans can live and contribute. Which is why whenever I'm talking about this, I always come back to the idea of reciprocity. To look and to absorb, to share that looking and absorbing, is to open up a view, a place, a locality, a landscape. To open it up to the perception of others. To open it up to a conversation and a sharing of perceiving. It's to allow the landscape to be more fully what it is through the growing involvement and engagement and commitment of others who are seeing. And in that process, inhabiting the world, not simply being there for a cheap overnight stay. St. Teresa of Avila famously said that life in this world was like a night in a cheap hotel. But although she was right about most things, I think she was possibly wrong about that. Lowering our expectations in that way may not quite be what is asked of us in cultivating and nourishing a spiritual presence in our world. And it's only if we understand something of that depth that can arise in relation to where we are and what we see, only in that we can adequately respond to the trauma, the questioning, the disorientation of those who are literally displaced. Only if we understand something of what is lost in the experience of the exile and the migrant are we going to be a good and communicative, conversational neighbor to the exile and the migrant. Lovett has quite a lot to say about being fed by a landscape understood in this way, represented in this way. And he has an intriguing couple of pages about the way in which so much of the development that we've seen in the last 3/4 of a century in our immediate environment, especially the urban environment and the environment on which and in which we travel, so much of it has been a matter of putting things alongside one another that don't talk to each other. How, he says, does the motorway talk to the countryside? Well, of course it doesn't. It shouts at it. And the landscape withdraws, folds its hands, and refuses to engage. But one can look at the architecture of many modern cities and ask, how on earth could anybody imagine that these bits of the environment speak to one another? If they can't speak to one another, they're not going to speak to you in a transforming or nourishing way. Another recent book is by a Cambridge scholar, Bonnie Lander Johnson, called Vanishing Landscapes. This is the proof copy. The actual book is much nicer and has pictures. And Bonnie Johnson in this book takes us through a series of historical encounters with plants, the importance of plant life in British history. If you want to understand the connection between the English Civil War and the shift in English drinking habits between the 17th and the 18th century, this is the book for you. But among many insightful things, she notes here the problem posed by any sort of work which assumes no relationship with the place it's in. She speaks about a globalized system, which was perhaps the most radically life-altering step in modernization. It reshaped human societies in ways that are hard fully to quantify. It has created vast wealth overall, but certainly not for all people. Alongside the industrial and now the digital revolution, the global finance system has invented forms of work that require of people no relationship with the landscape. What are we saying about our humanity? She suggests, as a question, what are we saying about our humanity if we say that it is of the essence of human labor that it is mobile, that making can be shifted around indifferently from continent to continent and location to location without any sense of what happens in a locality as work is continuously evolved. Again, let me be clear, neither Bonnie Johnson nor Stephen Lovett is simply saying the answer is to unscramble the last couple of hundred years and return to a pre-industrial society. They are much more saying, here is a crisis of the spirit and the imagination in our time, which on the whole we have failed to register and to explore in the depth which it deserves. And that is why, of course, a witness like that of Ronald Blythe is so significant. These words from Wormingford, and so much else that he wrote, are not nostalgic entertainment. They are not picturesque chocolate box models of an idealized past society. They are exercises in inhabiting, and as such, serious, challenging work, enlarging and enriching work. Going back for a moment to what Bonnie Johnson says about work that assumes no relation with a place. That, of course, also assumes that there are kinds of work which can be more or less divorced from the passage of time, or rather which become simply repetitive and mechanical, time-filling, rather than the accumulation of experience, understanding, narrative once again. If we lose our relationship to place, she suggests, we lose our relationship to time as well. Because the space we inhabit intelligently and imaginatively, is the space that has been seen and inhabited. We are not reading for the first time. And although this is a bit speculative, I'm quite tempted to connect it with the work of that remarkable genius, one of the geniuses who doesn't live in Suffolk, but on the Isle of Skye, Ian McGilchrist, in his work on the hemispheres of the brain. He speaks about how certain kinds of lesion in one hemisphere of the brain affect our understanding of time as well as space. If that part of the brain is not functioning as it should, we will not be able to make a pattern from what we see, and we will not be able to tell a story about what we see. We will be left with disconnected, granular, momentary perceptions. No story, no continuity, no participation, and so ultimately, no real self. And so there, I suppose, I come to one of the more ambitious bits of reflection in what I want to say this evening. And that is to suggest that a mentality unable to relate in this way to place and to time, a human mentality unable to inhabit over time and converse with others inhabiting and perceiving, is more and more shrinking what it means for us to be human, what it means to be a self. Or rather, it is colluding with a particular kind of myth about what selves are like. How many of us at some level take for granted the model pushed at us on all sides, that the human self, if it exists at all, is a hard little lump of self-contained agendas, desires, wants and needs. It pushes itself out into the world, determined to defeat other little lumps with different agendas. The world is a billiard ball table, and the clash of billiard balls is simply the ground level representation of the clash of arms, policies, and ideologies, producing in turn the clash of cry and complaint and lament that deafens us every time we look around. The Polish novelist Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize in 2018, writes about what she sees as one of the problems of contemporary European literature. Because, she says, we have so perfected a literature which privileges and indulges the perspective of the individual self, the literary world is a choir of soloists. That's her image, a choir of soloists. There's very little sense of a common fate, a common calling, a common environment. And the paradox, she says, is that in so much modern writing, there is both an intensity about the perspective of the unique self and a strange loss of specificity and depth in everything else. What's left is the individual agenda and its own shaping by and inhabiting of a larger environment becomes much more problematic. Let me read a little bit of her Nobel laureate lecture on this subject. A very remarkable document, I think. We live, she says, in a reality of polyphonic first-person narratives, and we are met from all sides with polyphonic noise. What I mean by first person is the kind of tale that narrowly orbits the self of a teller who more or less directly just writes about herself and through herself. We have determined that this type of individualized point of view, this voice from the self, is the most natural, human, and honest, even if it does abstain from a broader perspective. It also means building an opposition between the self and the world. And that opposition can be alienating at times. Whenever I go to book fairs, I see how many of the books being published in the world today have to do with precisely this, the authorial self. We want to be noticed. We want to feel exceptional. But what if our exceptional, unique identity as subjects and storytellers, as writers and imaginers, what if that uniqueness means absolutely nothing unless it is part of a pattern of unique points within an interactive system? This common space, says Tokarczuk, has a shape. Within it, the laws of physics sculpt an infinite number of forms incessantly linked to one another. Our cardiovascular system is like the system of a river basin. The structure of a leaf is like a human transport system. The motion of the galaxies is like the whirl of water flowing down the wash basin. Societies develop in a similar way to colonies of bacteria. The micro and macro scale show an endless system of similarities. Our speech, thinking and creativity are not something abstract, removed from the world, but a continuation on another level of its endless processes of transformation. Rather than a chorus of soloists, then, we look for a conversation of listeners, a conversation of persons who know something of their own deep interaction with an environment, who in writing or representing that environment are drawing others into relation with it. They are aware that they are not reading for the first time. We, as we read them or look at their work, we are aware that we are looking not just at, but with and through. We are in that process building a world in which we are who we are only because others have looked before us and others are looking now around us. To think and to imagine and to speak in that awareness, which, as I suggested earlier, is that sense of something always around the corner of our vision that we can't grasp. To speak and think from that perspective is to become a self of a very different kind from the billiard ball. To become a self that always exists because spoken to and speaking. Not an empty point, an empty singleness, but a place that exists because this is where forces and energies and presences converge. And it's because of that, as I said, quite ambitious, speculative sense of what it might be to be a human self, that I come back to the enormous importance of work like that of Ronald Blythe. If it seems ephemeral, if it seems belletristic, as some kinds of critic would say, time to think again. We need the nourishment provided by the experience and witness of those who know about inhabiting, who know that to speak about a landscape, a locality, is to speak about what has the look of something that is looked at. The roses in the garden of T.S. Eliot, the look of flowers that are looked at. The leaves of Scripture itself, as I said at the beginning, are flowers that are looked at, not abstract creations. We read together, we look together. And I would say the whole purpose of art and imagination is not so much to express the genius of any individual as to embody over and over again that strange and deep and obstinate aspect of our humanity which seeks attunement with the place where it finds itself, that learns in conversation, that listens deeply, and is ready to be fed in that listening. It is a spiritual vision of the human. Let's make no mistake about it and no apology for it. But without that spiritual dimension, however expressed, however understood, our humanity dwindles to the level, and I do mean the level, the flat surface of the billiard table with the balls clashing. We don't need to elaborate, I think, on the immediate present risks that we see in our world, not only with competing agendas, but competing agendas that set out to resist communion, sharing, understanding, and negotiation. We lock ourselves up in what we suppose to be self-evident self-identities, individual and corporate. We fail to listen to the experience of the stranger, and we fail to listen to the experience of the stranger within ourselves. That, again, obstinate, persistent stranger in our own hearts and minds, who is not satisfied with a mechanical, repetitive, two-dimensional world, but senses, often to their own surprise and shock, the address or the invitation of something that has been looked at, the sense of a world that asks us to interpret it and to love it, the sense of a world in which we may grow in communion at every level. There's a good deal more that could be said about that theologically, but I promised not to focus too much on theology this evening. I hope, though, that in the reflections I've shared, I may have succeeded just a little bit in suggesting why this much-loved local figure, whose memory we celebrate with such affection and gratitude, may not be as minor a person in our culture as some might like to say. That there are those who look, who share their looking, and who know that they are looking in the company of others. That nourishes our collective imagination at depths we may not fully recognize. But for that we can be profoundly and lastingly grateful. And in the light of that, we may perhaps go out from a reflective evening like this and see what we can do about it, and see how we are to resist, wherever we find ourselves, all those temptations to flatten the surface of the human map, to restrict the conversation and communion of the human mind and imagination, to lift us beyond time and space. My very last theological observation, I promise, is to go back to St. Augustine, the beginning of the 5th century, talking about how his attempts to rise to the contemplation of the transcendent were repeatedly frustrated because they were all about his ambition as an individual to rise to the contemplation of the transcendent. And how he began to contemplate the transcendent fully only when he embraced the earth that he stood on. Ronnie was a great embracer of the earth he stood on. It's a good example to follow. It's a good challenge to try to respond to. Thank you.
thought-provoking, of course, and we knew it would be. Can I suggest a couple of minutes, maybe just to think, have a conversation with someone next to you, take a couple of minutes, maybe formulate a question or a response or a reflection, and then we'll come round with microphones. Is that all right? Chance for a few little conversations and to stretch and think. So anybody who wants to. Do I see? I did see somebody.
One sort of observation and one question. Observation when you were talking about Ronald Blythe looking at things. I was reminded of Claude Monet and the way he painted the same scene over and over again, looking at it at different times of the day. And just a question, you talked about the way the motorway doesn't talk to the landscape. I'd be interested to know how you think a motorway might talk to a landscape. How a motorway might talk to a landscape.
Thank you. Just to respond to the first observation, absolutely right. I think one of the most intriguing things in great art of various kinds is the kind of artist who returns again and again and again to the same topic, looking at it afresh, a different light, every moment a different story, a different conversation to be had. And having watched at close quarters some of the work of my sister-in-law, who's a painter of some substance, you know, she paints about 10 people, mostly, over and over again, and painted her mother, my mother-in-law, I should think, some 60 or 70 times, because there's always more in a human face to reflect on. How do motorways and landscapes talk to each other? Well, certainly not the way they're set up at the moment, because the idea of the motorway is primarily about speed. And speed is what you don't need to, if you want to engage with what's around. I just don't know how you might design a transport system that actually didn't simply think that speed was the only task that a road had to live up to. But I don't know, we are so preoccupied with time saving, which is odd since we don't know what to do with time when we've saved it. So I don't know, it's just something I want to go on worrying about, I think. But it's, what comes back to me is that sense that if the question you're trying to answer, the problem you're trying to solve, is how to get from A to B as quickly as possible, then quite a lot follows. What if that's not the only question you're asking? Just as I think with a good building, and I'm sure there are architects in the audience who know more about this than I do, with a good building, you are, I think, asking several questions about what it's doing and trying to create something which deals with the variety of questions, the variety of purposes a building is addressing, rather than saying the point of this building is, in Corbusier's infamous remark, it's a machine for living in. What about all the other questions you might be asking? And, sorry, I'm rambling now, but not entirely irrelevantly. And it's a slightly mischievous comment, because I have a kind of personal interest in this. But when I was trying to run a college in Cambridge for a few years, one of the tasks that we set ourselves was building a new library. And for me, the process of watching that library come into being was very much a process of identifying the different questions we were trying to answer. This was not simply a storage space, and it wasn't simply a social space, and it wasn't simply a prestige project that needed to look nice in the river. All of those came into it. And I think one reason that the outcome is, I would say, spectacularly successful is that Neil McLaughlin, as the architect, knew exactly how to let those questions talk to each other and produced a building that talks to its environment as well. So I suppose it's about clarity about the questions you're asking. Sorry, wittering on, but let's have another question.
The question I was going to ask was about the issue of mindfulness. Is that in any way appropriate, or is it a sort of self-indulgence?
That's a very good question. Mindfulness. There's a kind of mindfulness language and rhetoric which tends to slip towards saying, I'll help to make you mindful so that you can be more hyperactive more efficiently. And I don't think that's much use. I think unless mindfulness is really transformative of how we approach what we are and what the world is, unless it can in some way actually put some real questions to us and our habits, not just give us breaks for sophisticated relaxation, then it's not doing its job. Now, I've been lucky enough to work with one or two mindfulness practitioners who do seem to understand that, in fairness. But I think there is also a trend sometimes to think, well, let's just inject a bit of mindfulness training to this, and then what you know, we'll have still more efficient hedge fund managers. And I'm not quite sure that's the answer to everything.
Thank you so much. It's such an inspiring talk, Rowan. I just want to share two words that came to my mind as you were concluding. The first was ecology, and the second was embodiment. And I'd never really felt them as so close theologically to Trinity and incarnation as perhaps I did when you were talking. But I wanted to ask, something about writing. Because one of the wonderful things I think about Ronald Blythe's product, his texts, is that they manage to convey and they contain this rich sense of ecology and embodiment, and yet they are just words. They're not pictures, they're not sculpture, they're not architecture, you can't feel them, and yet you do have this kind of bodily response to them. And I just wondered whether this was saying something to us about the healthy and creative and positive and theological richness of literature. And but that's such a miracle, because often when we speak, that isn't what happens. Speech is connected with the projections of the hard ego, often wrapped in sort of spiky anxiety. So the question is, how does one become a writer like Ronald Blythe?
I think you better read Ian's book. Thank you. I love the way you highlighted those two words, ecology and embodiment. I avoided them in a way in my exposition, partly because I think they can be just pulled out from the drawer sometimes in these discussions, and I wanted to try and come at it sideways a bit. But yes, I think ecology is a wonderful word, because it's essentially about that kind of magnetic pull towards balance and interaction that's around. To talk about the ecology of any system is to talk about the way in which it is a system of response, compensation for gaps or dropped balls, how it adjusts, how it extends, how it becomes durable, flexible, all these things. And it's why I quite like to apply the word ecology to the language of Christian doctrine. I think there's an ecology of religious teaching, which is exactly that continuing, sensitive, localized but flexible way of inhabiting a tradition. And embodiment, yes. I'm one of those who believes that the body is part of what we think with. Thinking doesn't happen inside here. We think, we respond intelligently with every movement we make, with every interaction we have with the world around us. So, but words and how to be a better writer and all the rest of it. I think, that what's going on in a really, really good verbal evocation of a landscape is precisely that it takes us time to read. It, draws us around, it leads us through. It's not a picture that we see in one go. We have to adjust to that time taking. It draws us therefore into what I call conversation. And that's how words ought to be working rather than in the weaponized way we normally use them. And the question, I think, for any writer or any speaker has to be at some level, am I letting my words work to build, or am I trying to make them work to win? And I think there's all the difference in the world between those. And a great writer is somebody who works with words to build, not to win.
Back to the motorway again. I had a quick thought. Last year we were fortunate enough to go to Sicily, and a lot of the roads, the motorways there, had flowers, bushes on the central reservation. And I thought that was a wonderful way of getting nature back to the motorway. But motorways, as you say, are built for speed, whereas we need to slow down, as you were just saying, take time. And perhaps that's where walking and pilgrimage comes in, because there you have time to stop and look. But also you you're travelling, you're relying on other people and their hospitality, so you get to know them and talk to them, as well as the people on the actual walk or pilgrimage.
So helpful, thank you. Yes, that's a wonderful analogy with pilgrimage. I think that, yeah, I'll let that stand with gratitude. Thank you. So.
I sensed a paradox at the heart of what you were saying, and I wondered if you could say a few words about the role of an artist or a poet, and how we guard against that, the dangers and the limits of the unique self, while at the same time putting something of that unique self into art in order to share it with others.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's a key question, isn't it? I guess the only short answer I can come up with, saving you another hour or two of thinking out loud, would be something like this. What, again, the responsible artist is doing is saying, this is what I see from here. The from here is me. It's what I've brought to it. It's my past, it's my skill, it's my perspective, it's my slant on it. That's, in a way, all I can give. But I offer it to you, my viewer, my reader, whatever, to say, from your unique point, this is what you can't see and I can. Just as there are things you can see that I can't. The arrogant artist, and they say there are a few of them, will say, this is what I see, so just shut up. So I like to think of what I call the responsible artist, as someone who is aware that what they're doing, what they're offering, is a perspective among others. Which doesn't mean that it's a perspective among others for them. They feel they've got to paint that or say that. There's a real sort of weight of authority. I've got to do this. But I've got to do this. What you've got to do won't be quite the same. But let's see where we get in that. But the paradox is there, you're quite right, and it's a paradox, Joe, you and I were just mentioning, that so many artists are intolerable human beings at times. And dispossession is not the name of the game. But then the gulf between what they do and who they are is just one of those things which, as every priest knows, is sometimes painful. I think we have time for one more.
I was very struck by the juxtaposition of place and displacement that you brought in. And having been a displaced person, and you mentioned displacement and displacement, and what came to mind was in the book of Daniel, when in the exile, when God asks, when they're asked to sing their songs, and they say, how can we sing our songs when our hearts are saved?
Strange land, yes.
And yet, God asks them to pray and bless the new place that they are in, to multiply, to have their children, to create their families. And this idea of what came to me is this incredible creation, whether you're based somewhere like Ronald Blythe was for so long and you're reflecting on it, or whether you're displaced somewhere and you contemplate that and you bless that. I just wondered if that was part of your thinking.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's really, really insightful. A couple of things just come to mind there. One is, a few years ago I was involved in helping to organise a conference in Cambridge on migrant art. And that sort of morphed into an event where we were looking at, for example, things that people brought with them when they had to run. What do people seize if they've got to leave their houses? What do they carry into a new context, and what does it mean for them? And how does the new context understand the significance for them and with them? So the conference ended up being something rather different from a conventional academic conference, because we were asking of migrant people exactly what was going on there. The book of that is, I hope, going to appear in a month or two. Please God, it's been a long haul. But that certainly focused my mind on some of this question. How does that migrant experience, as you put it, bless the new context that people are entering into? And very poignantly, a memory of visiting a refugee center in Ukraine not long after the war started, and speaking to a group of people who had fled eastern Ukraine under appalling pressure. And at the end of this, a woman came up to me and said, stay there, something I must show you. And she sent her daughter, it must have been about 12 or 13, back to where they were sleeping to fetch what they'd seized and brought with them, which was a large Ukrainian lute. It was the music they wanted to hang on to and affirm as they travelled. And she got her daughter, poor thing, to sit there and play us a tune on this lute just to show that they were not going to be separated from that. That was what they were bringing with them. Very moving moment, but many such moments, and I'd love to think more about how that works and how we understand it. Thank you.
As always, for anyone who's listened to you over a period of time, your former students, of whom there are a few of us here today, we leave here our minds and our imaginations stretched and enriched. And for me, particularly, the way in which you have encouraged us to look again at Ronnie's writings as perhaps more deeply serious and profound than we had thought and known from when we just enjoyed a word from Wormingford or reread Akenfield, that actually to see him far more seriously and profoundly as someone who helps us to see in landscape and people. So I'm hugely grateful for that. I'm hugely grateful for your other insights and leaving stretched and challenged, and thank you so much. Thank you. I believe there are more books available to purchase, some of which may be signed, I hope. We look to be in touch with you with more information about next year's lectures and other lectures that we do here to celebrate St. Edmund, to celebrate St. Benedict, and to celebrate Ronnie Blythe. But thank you so much for being here tonight. Apologies, cathedrals are never very warm places, but we turned the heating off at the beginning of May as well. So at least trying to be eco-friendly. Safe home, thank you very much for being here. Good night.